Thank you for the warm welcome. Welcome, everyone. How are we doing this morning?
Good.
We're going to have a conversation today. I walk the room and I just ask people, what do you want to hear today? Some people want us to go from Genesis to Exodus, the conversation. And we're going to see if we can do that today because Hannibal and I are just going to talk with each other up here. And then we're going to open it up later on for some question and answer there. But just to give you a little bit about Mr. Hannibal Johnson, he's a Harvard Law School graduate. That's the way you're supposed to say it, all right? Harvard. An attorney and a consultant. But I'll add another title to that. He's a historian. He helps tell the story. I ask, your challenge today is, what is your story? He's taught at the University of Tulsa School of Law, Oklahoma State, University of Oklahoma, and he serves on a numerous number of boards that I don't know how he has the time to do that, but he does, and he gives back to the community that way. He's written several books. Just to let you know, there are some of his books in the back. Then at the end, there will be a book signing where you can purchase a book and actually have it autographed by the author. And he's received numerous rewards for his work in his community. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome Hannibal Johnson to you. The theme today is talk about 100 years of the Tulsa race massacre. And, a lot of people know the story or think they know the story, that there was this incident. I call it the elevator incident, but it was really more than that. And so what I want to do today is I want to have a conversation, not from the obvious, but the not so obvious, about what happened in Tulsa, what happened in Greenwood District. And by the end of the day, or our conversation, where do we need to go? So if you could just start off, let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about the elevator incident and really, what are the other factors that were associated with the elevator incident?
I think it's important to understand what Tulsa was like in 1921, what America was like in 1921. The national context is everything. So the massacre itself is really emblematic of a lot of the historical racial trauma or violence that occurred in the United States during this period. If you talk to sociologists and historians, they often talk about the nadir of race relations in America. Nadir just means the low point. And they're talking about the early part of the 20th century. Why are they talking about that period? Because even 2 years prior to 1921, in 1919, James Weldon Johnson of NAACP talked about Red Summer, the summer and fall of 1919 after World War I. That was a period during which there were more than 24 events that were called race riots in the United States, in New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore, and Omaha, Chicago, Elaine, Arkansas, Longview, Texas, on and on and on. During this period, lynching was also a phenomenon. It was prevalent across the United States. Lynching is a form of domestic terrorism. Often the victims are Black. So during this period, those twin terrors, if you will, are occurring all throughout the United States. And we come to what happened in Tulsa. Tulsa is just a continuation of that pattern of racial violence in the United States. So that national context is really, really important. It's also important to think about the broader environment in Tulsa. So there are a number of other factors that made Tulsa what I consider to be kind of a powder keg or a tinderbox. And the elevator incident is just a trigger event, right? It's a catalyst. So what else was going on in Tulsa? The Black community, historic Black community in Tulsa called the Greenwood District, was located right across the Frisco tracks, literally across the Frisco tracks from downtown Tulsa. It's a segregated Black community. And that land was desired by corporate interests and railroad interests. So there was talk before 1921, moving the Black community farther north and using that land for higher and better purposes. So that's one thing. The other thing that's important to think about is philosophy or ideology around race that was dominant during the period. So that would be white supremacy. We can't avoid talking about that. Because if white supremacy is the prevailing mentality, then having a successful Black business community like the Greenwood community was becomes a problem. Because if you're a white person, you're not doing well economically. You can literally go to the Frisco tracks, stand on those tracks, and look to the Black side across the tracks and see people driving cars, owning homes, dressing well, owning businesses. And so that causes jealousy, or I think the preferred term for me is the psychological term, cognitive dissonance. So if you hold in your mind a particular view of the way the world ought to be, and you see evidence that is counter to that, what you want to do is harmonize that dissonance. So one way to do that would be to lash out, to strike at the Black community, to bring the Black community down a few pegs, so that that ideology that you harbor in your mind is the reality on the ground. In Tulsa during the 1910s, 1920s, particularly the 1920s, and in Oklahoma generally, the Klan, the iconic domestic terrorist organization, the Ku Klux Klan, had a tremendous presence, not just in Tulsa, but in Oklahoma generally. That's a factor. And then finally, we talk about the role of the media in society as well. We should today. The media were no less important back then. But back then, it was primarily print newspapers. Print newspaper called the Tulsa Tribune, a daily afternoon newspaper that published a series of inflammatory, incendiary articles and editorials that fomented hostility in sectors of the white community against the Black community. So what you have in Tulsa in 1921 is this combustible mix of factors that led to the outbreak of violence. That combustible mix was actually ignited by the elevator incident that you referenced. So the elevator incident is a trigger rather than a fundamental cause of the massacre.
How many of y'all learned a lot more than you ever knew just in that one answer? Then that's where we're going today. So we had this incident. We recovered, but also another part of what's happening, or the story that's been told, is that the Greenwood district burned down. But that's not the rest of the story. The resiliency of the community. What happened after it burned down? What's that mindset that's there?
Let me ask the question because it gives me an opportunity. I'm going to read to you an exchange of two letters, because when I talk about the history, I say that the overarching narrative here is about what I call the indomitable human spirit. That really is what the story is about. Yes, the massacre is an important element in the story. Yes, the fact that the Greenwood community was considered Black Wall Street because of incredible economic development and entrepreneurship. But ultimately, the story is about people in a community of a certain character and with certain values. I'm going to read to you an exchange of letters. These letters were written immediately after the massacre in 1921. The letters are exchanged between two gentlemen, a fellow named Curtis, who lived in Detroit. And he was writing to his friend Oliver in Tulsa, essentially to check up on him and see if things were okay after the massacre. And I think that you will agree with me that Oliver's response to Curtis's letter tells you everything you need to know about the character of the people of the Greenwood district. So the initial letter to Oliver from Curtis reads, "Dear Oliver, I am by our local newspaper fully advised of the whole terrible tragedy there. Now that they have destroyed your homes, wrecked your schools, reduced your business places to ashes, and killed your people, I am sure that you will rapidly give up the town and move north. Enclosed, please find a draft for $40 to purchase your ticket to Detroit. We'll be expecting you, Curtis." And the response, "Dear Curtis, how kind of you to volunteer your sympathetic assistance. It's just like you to be helpful to others in times of stress like these. True it is, we are facing a terrible situation. It is equally true that they have destroyed our homes, wrecked our schools, they have reduced our churches to ashes, and they have murdered our people, Curtis. But they have not touched our spirit. And while I speak only for myself, let it be said that I came here and built my fortune with that spirit. I shall reconstruct it here with that spirit. And I expect to live on and die here with it. Oliver. So the story is the story of the Olivers of the world, right? The people who are visionary, people who are persistent, people who are resilient, people who are of faith, people who maintain hope. That's the real story here. So when you hear about the massacre in 1921, you should also know that even as the embers of the destroyed community still smolder, the rebuilding began. 1925, the Greenwood community and the Black community in Tulsa hosted the national meeting of the National Negro Business League, which is Booker T. Washington's Black Chamber of Commerce. The peak of the community as a business community comes not before the massacre, but after, in the early to mid 1940s, when there were well over 200 documented Black-owned operated businesses in the community. So the story here is much bigger than the massacre. The massacre is kind of a window into the story for some people, but we can't stop there. We have to understand the broad narrative of what I call the indomitable human spirit.
And that's one thing that's missing from all the narratives that I heard about the massacre. They don't talk about the spirit that is up there. They don't talk about the rebuilding of the community. And there was also an economic structure that was up there. I remember seeing a quote that every dollar changed hands 18 times within that community before it left that community. Think about that. They were spending their money with internally to each other. Go ahead.
So yes, I'm glad you brought that up. Why were they doing that? They were doing that because they had to. They were doing that because of segregation. It's ironic, but the effect of segregation in the context of the small business economy that was like Wall Street is that it forced dollars to be constrained within the district and circulate within the district. And even Black people who worked outside the community, they brought those dollars back to the community. So if you were one who worked, say, as a domestic in a white home in South Tulsa, you went to work, you brought your money back in the community, you got your hair done, you got a meal, you went to a movie, etc. So it really helped undergird the economy. I talk about an economic detour. I think that kind of metaphor is helpful. So you can imagine these Black folks approaching the gates of economic opportunity in downtown Tulsa being turned away, detoured back into the Greenwood community. So they created opportunities for one another in this segregated Black community. The other irony, many decades later, is that when integration comes along, it has a negative effect on the economy of this Black business district. Why? Because you can purchase goods and services of a greater variety at better price points outside the community. The dollars aren't constrained in the community anymore. And so, again, ironically, it undermines the financial foundation of the community, and the community begins to decline, which leads to the city signing on to urban renewal projects that do things like put a highway right through the heart of the Greenwood district.
I'm glad you mentioned urban renewal because I was going to bring up the highway. And if you haven't been to the Greenwood district, there's this highway that goes right in between it. And all of you all travel in here, and you can see urban renewal projects throughout the country. Originally, I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. They put a highway through one of our predominantly Black neighborhoods. It destroyed the community there. That's what a lot of things urban renewal accomplished. Look at that footprint and where it went. So I want to stay on economics for a minute, especially for the Black community. So what does the Black or people of color community need to do now? Because there's still power in the dollar. There's still power in the economics. And it seems like that's not being taught, or it's not in anyone's narrative that you need to understand how powerful your dollars are. What can we take away from the massacre and help educate the youth that are here and the educators that are here, that we need to be talking about this more?
I served as education chair for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission and did a lot of work around what I call the Black Wall Street mindset, which really goes to the crux of your question. And so one of the important reasons for teaching this history and incorporating it into regular curricula is that we understand that we, specifically Black folks, but other folks as well, we have these historical role models who did great things against seemingly insurmountable odds, right? We need to know about that. So the Black Wall Street mindset conceptually just involves leveraging this history of Black business people and Black entrepreneurs and using it as kind of a launching pad for ourselves, understanding that, yes, we face challenges, but we'll never face challenges, I hope, that are as great as those people faced in the early 1910s, 1920s. And we're not limited. They were limited geographically to a particular market, the market within the neighborhood. We're not limited that way. In fact, because of technology, our market is not just the neighborhood, not just the city, not just the state, not just the nation, but the world. The Black Wall Street mindset is fundamentally about embracing the values that those people embraced: perseverance, resilience, so forth, and understanding that whatever it is we might want to do in the economic sphere, people who look like us have done it before, against challenges that are greater than we'll ever face. And that's why the word mindset is important. The biggest challenge is the challenge that's here.
I agree with that. Every day when you all wake up, you struggle with something, and I call it, we need to capture the morning first after we get up and then go from there. So we have this mindset there. We have this history that we have here. There seems to be a movement across some platforms where they want to silence history being talked about. Greenwood was not the only place this happened.
No, not at all.
Some people think, oh, this only happened in Greenwood. No, this happened throughout the country, and it's been silenced. So why do you think it was silenced at Greenwood? Why do you think it's been silenced throughout the country, that we've had communities that were burned down, destroyed, or people completely moved off of their property because of the powers to be?
Well, there are a number of factors that went into the silence around the history in Tulsa. The first and foremost is that when this happened in Tulsa in 1921, Tulsa was really on an incredible upward trajectory to becoming the self-described oil capital of the world. So the leadership of Tulsa wanted Tulsa to be perceived a welcoming, cosmopolitan city. So the wealthy business folks who were coming to Tulsa because of the oil business could be comfortable there. So it was in their interest then to minimize what happened in the Green District. In some sectors of the Tulsa community, the white community, there was shame. There was kind of disbelief that this could have happened in their city, the city that they loved, cherished, and so forth. In the Black community, there was PTSD. Even, I'm not sure the term was even coined then, post-traumatic stress disorder, in the sense that there was fear that this happened once, it could happen again. And in fact, it happened in other places like Rosewood in 1921. Anxiety. So in talking to some of the survivors, there were more than 100 survivors alive in about 2000 when the state created riot commission was meeting. A lot of those folks talked about the fact that in their families, the this history simply was not discussed because the elders in the family thought that it might have a debilitating effect on young people, that might stunt their growth and their life prospects. So they just didn't talk about it. The people who controlled the curriculum back then, and up until relatively recently, chose intentionally not to include this history for a variety of reasons. So it's all those things that came together. It's the confluence of those things that led us to where we are today, which is us beginning to integrate this history in the curriculum in meaningful ways, which is something that should have been done decades ago. And I would say we have suffered because of it. So some of the issues that we face today around race and racism and all those sorts of factors, even human relations generally, are traceable to the fact that we have been reluctant to acknowledge the unpleasant parts of our history. You know, Maya Angelou says something really profound that I talk about a lot. She said, our history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But if faced with courage, it need not be lived again. So she's essentially saying we ignore the lessons of our history at our own peril. We choose to ignore our history, we will suffer for it. I think what we know bears that out.
And that's for everyone. That's for everybody, that there's history in your family, and for whatever reason we are reluctant to talk about it. I know that my grandparents were from the South, and my grandfather said once he left the South, he would never, ever go back. And he never did. He stayed up north. And so we have to be careful about how we look at our history. So my challenge for you all today, you didn't know you were going to get homework assignments from me, is that you all need to look at your own respective history in your family and make sure you're capturing it, because that is your history. That's your lineage to your family and the rest of the world. So you talked about the psychological part of this, and you served on the commission for the 400 years of history, of African American history. Let's go there for a minute. Let's talk about the psychological damage too that you feel that we as Blacks have experienced and are continuing to experience today. And is there anything that can be done to help reverse this shift?
Well, you know, the cliche, knowledge is power. It's a cliche because there's so much truth there, right? That's why it's a cliche. So I think we need to do a much better job of understanding, you've already alluded to this, but understanding our own experiences, our own history. It's funny because every time February rolls around, February's Black History Month. I like to tell people, if I had my way, if I had the power, there would not be a Black History Month. There wouldn't be a February Black History Month. Because that history would be rightfully incorporated into the regular history curriculum. Because it's American history. You can't know American history unless you know Black history. They're inextricably intertwined. So knowing about the past, knowing the history is as important for people who are in our audience who are white, people who are in our audience who are white and teenagers, as it is for me, as somebody who's older than I'm going to claim I am, and Black. I mean, it's important for all of us. We have to understand how we have worked together, how we have been in conflict, how we have been in relationships in the past, to understand how we are, where we are, and what we could possibly do to advance together.
So we all have to go through the struggle together. We all have to be able to be willing to look at ourselves in the mirror and talk to have the history conversations. So if you were, I want to ask you, You're in charge. Well, no, let me go back. Let's go back to him for a second. From the educational aspect also. So Tulsa was a vibrant community. There's the railroad tracks and the Greenwood district and all that. But what else happened in Oklahoma? What about the black towns? What about Langston? How did all of that also have a part in the growth and development of Oklahoma, period?
Oklahoma has such incredibly rich history. It's a shame that we don't do a great job of really teaching a holistic view of history. One of the things that's important to understand when we're looking at a community like the Greenwood District is a broader perspective on how Black folks got to Oklahoma in the first place. So there are two major waves that I like to talk about. Now, I'll probably ask a couple questions to see if we know some of this history. People are probably generally familiar with the so-called Trails of Tears, probably most familiar with the Cherokee Trail of Tears, but there were five civilized tribes from the southeast who were moved to Oklahoma in the 1830s and 1840s: the Cherokees, the Muscogee Creeks, the Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles. How many of you are aware of the fact that all five of the five civilized tribes engaged in the practice of chattel slavery and had black slaves? How many of you are aware of that? So they did. How many of you are aware that the five tribes officially sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War? So that's history we don't really talk about. We need to know all that to understand some of the dynamics of that. So a wave of Black folks came to Oklahoma prior to statehood with the five tribes in the 1830s and 1840s. Most of those folks ultimately received land allotments at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when the tribal communal lands were broken up. It's Black people who received land post-Civil War. That's amazing, because other Black folks didn't receive land from the federal government. So that was an accession to wealth, and that relative wealth from some of these people called freedmen, Black people associated with the five tribes. Some of that wealth that they had really helped communities like the Greenwood community and some of the all-Black towns. The all-Black towns were formed really intentionally. There was a fellow named Edward McCabe. McCabe had been the state auditor in the state of Kansas, elected in 1882, 1884, came to Oklahoma with land run in 1889, founded Langston, where Langston University is. And he began a movement called boosterism, encouraging Black folks, particularly Black folks from the Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, to come to Oklahoma on the premise that there was great opportunity economically and that Oklahoma would represent an escape from the kind of political oppression that they faced in the Deep South. So McCabe, he drafted these bulletins and circulars that he sent down south. He actually hired agents and sent them down south to recruit Blacks to come to Oklahoma Territory. He met with the United States President Benjamin Harrison in 1890 to talk about carving out a Black state within the Oklahoma Territory. This was all really high-level stuff. The Black state obviously didn't materialize, but a number of Black towns were formed primarily between 1890 and 1910. So Oklahoma has had more than 50 all-Black towns in its history. And so those Black towns were, again, designed to be oases of opportunity for Black people who were discriminated against really extensively in the Deep South. What's really ironic about this boosterism that praised Oklahoma as a promised land is Oklahoma becomes a state in what year? 1907. And the first act passed by the Oklahoma legislature is Senate Bill number 1, which rigidly segregated railroad facilities. A number of other segregation edicts followed by the Oklahoma legislature. So you have these folks coming from the Deep South thinking they're escaping the political oppression that they face there. Come to Oklahoma. Oklahoma achieves statehood, then begins to mirror or mimic the kind of laws that were passed in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. pretty amazing stuff. But that's all context and background you really need to know to understand some of the dynamics that play out even in 2021 in Oklahoma.
Last night's gonna go deep. I'm almost guaranteed everyone has learned something in the past 30 minutes. We're gonna keep going. Because that's the thing about history. If you get the rest of the story, you'll be amazed of how some of the thought processes are developed, because it comes from our history. And I tell people, a lot of times I ask them if they know me, and they say, yeah, they know me. But I don't. I start back. I started saying, I'm Daryl Davis. I'm the son of Chester and Grace Davis, but my family started in Oklahoma with an Indian chief and a black female slave. And that's my history. But that's what people tell me, because I don't have any way to confirm it. I don't have that history there. It wasn't written. It wasn't documented. It was all my family that was passed down from generation to generation in my family. You talked a little bit about the Native Americans and African Americans. There was also a stronger tie there here in Oklahoma that we were together a lot longer than people actually think they are. Did you have any thoughts on that?
One of the things we don't do well in terms of this historical knowledge is the relationship between Native Americans and African Americans. There are issues going on even as we speak within the 5 tribes about the citizenship rights of so-called freedmen. So the Cherokees have actually done the best job in resolving this, but it took years for them to do this. After the Civil War, again, the 5 tribes officially aligned with the Confederacy. So the 5 tribes negotiated treaties with the federal government. Part of the agreement from the tribes, one exception, Chickasaw, but the tribes agreed to bring into citizenship the people that they had formerly enslaved. But in recent decades, there have been controversy in all 5 tribes about the citizenship rights of these Black folks within the tribes. They are tribal members. Thing to remember about tribes, when you think about Cherokee Nation, Muskogee Creek Nation, the tribes are not races, they're political entities. They're political entities. So tribes have always adopted people, incorporated people who are not culturally like them. So keep that in mind. Think about the freedmen, these Black people. So there was certainly intermarriage between natives and Black folks. So some of the people who are labeled freedmen are actually culturally and by blood members of these various tribal communities. Some are not. Most of the freedmen are associated or affiliated with the tribes by virtue of those treaties called the Treaties of 1866 that the 5 tribes executed with the federal government, agreeing to incorporate their formerly enslaved people as citizens. Very much like the United States, former slaves became citizens of the United States. So, but in recent years, there's been controversy, efforts to remove citizenship rights from these freedmen. And again, the Cherokee Nation has gone through a process that ultimately wound up in federal court in Washington, D.C. and was resolved a few years ago. The Cherokees are now kind of the model for how to reincorporate or re-engage the freedmen back into the tribe. There's a lawsuit pending right now with the Muskogee Creek Nation. The Seminoles had a lawsuit a couple of decades ago. So there's still some controversies that really date back more than a century. So not knowing this history it is a problem, right? If you remember the Cherokee Nation, you're culturally and ethnically Cherokee, and you don't know the history, then you might ask yourself, why are these Black folks trying to come into our community and take benefits that don't belong to them? right? But if you know the history, then you know the relationship that goes back decades and centuries between and among these various communities.
And that's a struggle that we have. So how do we keep the purity of the history going? How do we do that? Just take Greenwood, take the number of deaths up there, take the burials of those people up there. We don't have a good historical recollection of who was buried and where they're buried. So I know there's an effort up there in Tulsa to excavate graves and try to find that. And you're part of the Greenwood establishment. How is that coming along, and where does it need to go? Is there an end in sight?
So I think what Mayor G.T. Bonnet did a couple of years ago was really a wise choice, because I believe that to the extent there are historical questions that are unanswered that we have a way to possibly answer them, we should pursue that. So Mayor Bonham said essentially, there's a possibility that we have victims of murder. What is murder? Buried in Tulsa, and we need to either confirm or disprove those accounts from survivors, from witnesses, and so forth. So we're in the process of a mass graves investigation. There have been accounts of mass graves being dug post-massacre that have persisted really since the massacre. And so, I don't know if you're aware, but the state convened a commission called the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa race riot in 1921. That commission met from 1997 to 2001. They did a great report. One of the things they looked at was the possibility of mass graves. So they engaged an archaeologist and did some work using scientific instruments at a couple of sites, 3 sites, I think, in Tulsa, but back then, 20 years ago. They found some indication that there might be a mass grave at Oak Lawn Cemetery, which is near downtown Tulsa. But that commission, it sunsetted, it went out of business in 2001 and all worked on all the issues that it was looking at and stopped. So Mayor Bynum reactivated that work on the search for mass graves, possible mass graves, a couple of years ago. There's been another excavation. There were some remains found. We're in the process of trying to identify those remains to determine whether they're connected to the massacre. Remember, there was a huge Spanish flu outbreak during that same period. So there was an inordinate number of deaths right around that period. So we need to make sure for doing this investigation that whatever bodies that may be found, if any, are actually connected to those events. But the process is a sound process. The process is one of trying to understand the unanswered questions that linger from our history. We'll never know how many deaths occur exactly. We'll never know that. Why? Because, again, not only the possibility of mass graves, but we surmise that some people were buried summarily by their own families, and the documentation is not there. The record keeping was many. We know that hundreds of people were injured. Some of those people left town and no doubt died elsewhere. They're buried someplace else. We'll never know the exact number. But to the extent that we can get closer to the number, and to the extent that we can verify where possible any oral narratives or historical accounts, we should do that.
Right, that's great. And that's also trying to help build and give more concrete information about the history. So there's a museum now, and I call it, or someone's called it, maybe that's some cultural tourism opportunities there. How does that ability to have the Greenwood Rising facility, how does that help It's helped in a healing process, an educational process, an economic process.
Yes. So yeah, so I was lead curator, local curator for Greenwood Rising, which is called the Black Wall Street History Center. We work closely with an exhibit design firm in New York City called Local Projects. They do work all over the world. They're fantastic. The idea in Greenwood Rising is to present to the patron a narrative of Tulsa's historic Greenwood district. So it doesn't center on the massacre. The massacre is an element of the narrative, but it's not the whole. So the facility presents a story in 4 galleries. The first is the Greenwood Spirit, which talks about people like Oliver and what they imagined and what they created and what they resurrected. The next gallery is Arc of Oppression, which talks about the national context for the violence that happened in Tulsa. The third gallery is Changing Fortune, what happened after the massacre, the remarkable rebuilding, and the ups and downs, and all the way through integration and urban renewal and all of that. Final gallery is Journey to Reconciliation. So the concept here is that we take a patron through the experience of the history and the national context, and then we challenge that patron to use the knowledge that they gain, to leverage that to addressing some of the challenges we face around race today. So we present really provocative questions about reparations, about mass incarceration, about police community relations. We have a dialogue space to focus the attention of the patron on the through line between the then and the now. And then finally, we offer an opportunity for each person to get in touch with their own agency, their own change-making capacity. We ask each patron to leave a commitment. What are you going to do to move the needle on racial reconciliation in your community, whether you're from Tulsa or Edmond or Oklahoma City or Paris? Doesn't matter. We all have challenges. We all have agency or capacity to be engaged and to promote change.
Well, your last homework assignment maybe for me is this, that when you go up to Tulsa and you go to the gathering place, have a little bit of time and go over here to the Greenwood Rising and educate yourself on some things that you didn't know. Just get a different experience up there. Very good. So we're almost running out of time, but I do have to ask this question. Our audience today are teachers, business leaders, law enforcement, or first responders, and I don't know who, with our technology now, do not know who's out on the net. So we have a variety of people here. What do you want them to take away from our conversation today?
Probably first and foremost, the imperative of understanding history as a necessary element to being an engaged citizen in the present. Does that make sense? We have a number of challenges today, probably take more time than we would ever have to sort of even just list the challenges that we face. But you're going to be much more effective as a change agent in addressing those challenges if you understand the context in which those challenges exist. And you can't understand context unless you understand history. So, yeah, and you each have the capacity to delve into that history and to make yourself and your community better for having done that.
So now, it's time to open up the floor. You've been sitting there, your head is swelling with all this new information that you didn't know 5 minutes ago. So what are they? It's a question and answer. What questions are burning in your mind right now? What didn't we cover? Or what from what you heard, the testimony you heard, what questions has arisen? Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here, first of all. But I'm curious, as after the riots and everything, there was so much damage and devastation that went on. Did they go back to build on? Was it successful? For how long? Or did they move on because the trains and the city wanted to take over the property?
So the city, a couple of things happened. So the city first tried to extend the fire code to the Greenwood district, which would have made it cost prohibitive for rebuilding to occur. That was actually challenged by B.C. Franklin, who was a prominent lawyer. His son, John L. Franklin, was an eminent historian at Duke. But so that happened. The rebuilding began. Contributions came in from places like the NAACP headquarters in New York City. There were drives nationally in black churches to raise money to send to the Greenwood community. Why? Because Greenwood was important symbolically as a message about resilience and so forth. So the community, exhibited that sort of resilience that I've talked about. It refused to be moved by the city. The other thing that happened after the massacre was the mayor was T.D. Evans, and of course we had a chamber of commerce, we had a city commission form of government. It's interesting that all three of those referred to the event as and I'm quoting, Negro uprising, right? It was those people's fault that their community was destroyed by a mob of people who didn't look like them. That tells you everything you need to know about the kind of racial dynamics that existed at the time. But it also points you back to what I talked about earlier in terms of indomitable human spirit. So even in the face of that kind of hatred and hostility, the people in the Greenwood community were able to rebuild and to rebound and to create a community that was actually larger in terms of number of businesses that had existed prior to the massacre.
Yes.
We've had discussions at our home with our grown kids about not hearing, they didn't learn any of this. My husband and I obviously didn't learn any of this in Oklahoma City Public Schools. Our grown kids went through Edmond Public Schools and didn't learn this. Can you talk about how you're putting this into the curriculum that will be taught now in Oklahoma?
So the Centennial Commission worked closely with State Department of Education. The governor was actually very supportive of infusing this history into curricular materials. The State Department of Education created lesson plans and so forth. The commission created its own lesson plans and curricular documentation that's on the commission's website. So we had broad support for that initiative. I have to mention this. Okay. So unfortunately, there's a piece of legislation that's been passed that really threatens those efforts. And it is unfortunate. It's unfortunate for all of us. And so I know that the governor has said that he doesn't feel like the legislation challenges the ability to teach this history as part of the curriculum. I beg to differ. I think it does. Unfortunately, I think it creates what I would call a chilling effect. Okay, so I think it creates a chilling effect because anything that leads to uncertainty on the part of educators about whether they should or can, and to what extent, how deep do we go, all that uncertainty just makes it less likely that educators will actually pursue this. Some educators will, no matter what, and I applaud them. But I understand people who are really reluctant. If you live in a small town in Oklahoma, and you don't know whether it's okay to do this, if you have that doubt, then you may not do it. I get it. So the legislation is, in my mind, a setback to our ability to incorporate this history.
Question. So what gives you hope for us figuring this out, or at least moving in the right direction? What does give you hope?
You know, I'm in agreement with Rising a fair amount just because my office is actually literally right across the street. So I'm really hopeful when I see people touring a facility and being moved by it and talking about the history and being engaged and wanting to learn. I'm hopeful because we have two teenagers sitting right in the front row. That pretty much. How can you not be hopeful in the face of that? And I'm generally an optimistic person, glass half full. And so I guess part of me asked the question, what is the alternative to being hopeful? I can't imagine other way that I could live with myself if I didn't have hope that things are going to improve. One of the things I do talk about quite a bit is I think many of us have to get used to the notion that change is incremental. So it's like this and not like this. So if you can be happy with these little bitty victories, I think it's much more manageable, right? We're not going to have the change that we think ought to be, and people, and you want everybody else to understand that it's huge, immediate change that just generally does not work. It's small victories. It's one step forward, two steps back. And I would regard the legislation as two steps back, by the way. But it's not insurmountable. We'll figure out a way to make this work. All of us, we'll figure out a way to do it.
About small changes, and I guess I would want to know from your perspective, is that what reconciliation looks like?
Absolutely. And so the question is, does reconciliation look like small changes? Absolutely, because I think it starts on an individual basis. That you embrace the notion of reconciliation. And you think about who's in your circle. Is it diverse, or is it just people who look like you? Who's the membership of your sorority, your church, all that? Do you engage regularly on more than a superficial basis with people who are not like you? What are the things that you could do better to reach out and to engage with broader elements of the community? Once you're engaged with those broader elements of the community, what can you all together do that can have an impact? What can the city of Edmond teach the state of Oklahoma? I mean, I think it just sort of, it grows, but it starts with the individual.
I think that the Black community today has kind of lost that Oliver mindset, and it's how do we get that back, and how do people that look like me help the Black community get that back?
Interesting. So I can only speak for myself, Black community, and I'm not sure I know. So the Black community is certainly not monolithic, but there are elements of the Black community that are like. So I think in terms of what you can do, listen to people who are Black and ask them what it is you can do. Not just ask me, ask other folks. So you're probably gonna get a variety of responses. Do I think that we can do a better job understanding and leveraging the role models like the Olivers of the world? Absolutely. So what you can do on that score is make sure that we continue to have this history as part of the curriculum, and that we're not sidetracked by legislative measures or other things that tend to undercut this history.
Next question.
Would an effort to get signatures help with the legislation to get the curriculum put in our?
an effort to get signatures help move the legislation?
I think we need to look at a number of options and you know, maybe that is something we could look at. Making sure that the people who crafted the legislation understand how we feel about it, particularly we who are not Black, for example. I mean, I think that's goes back to your question. So what can allies do on some of these issues? If you're talking specifically about that legislation, make sure that, you know, people who craft such legislation understand that there is a wide variety of views on if we should address our past. That you think that the legislation takes us down a road that is not healthy and productive, that there are other routes. I think it will be received differently coming from you as opposed to coming from me, for example. Does that make sense? When in doubt, let your voice be heard, I guess is the fundamental message. Let people know that you think this is an important issue and you're looking for ways to make things better.
Appreciate the conversation we had today. Taking the time to tell us about some history that we didn't know. Challenging us. So you challenged us today for some self-reflection. Educate yourself, educate others. We're all learners here. That's one of the reasons why we're here, because we're all learners. Keep learning, keep educating people on history. And then the last challenge, my last homework assignment for you today is, what are you going to do next? It's 10:28 today. What are you going to do at 10:28 tomorrow to help change the narrative of the history that not only from Tulsa, but from the state of Oklahoma? Sir, thank you. We appreciate you. For being here today. What we're going to do now, the program's going to move to the back. There is a book, there are books back there that you can actually purchase and have autographed. And if you're like me, I would love to have an autographed book. So for the next 30 minutes or so, that's where we're going to be in the back. Thank you for attending.
Huh?